I just want to welcome everybody to this evening's meeting about why Palestine is still the current issue for us today. My name is Emma Davis. I'm a Joint Equalities Officer for, is there any point in using this? Yeah. Okay. For Barking and Dagenham National Education Union. And I'm also a member of Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I recently took part in the delegation last October that the National Education Union leads to Palestine in solidarity with the teachers union there, the GOP, and I really feel that it is fantastic that we're having this meeting tonight, and we have really incredible speakers, so we'll be having a really important discussion. First off, I do want to apologise that Ben Jamal will not be able to make it tonight. It is PSC's Palestinian Expo today, and he already knew when he agreed to come that he was in danger of having overbooked himself, so he does send his apologies. But we do have a fantastic platform of speakers. We're going to I'll be introducing each before they speak. We'll be starting with Noor Masalha. Noor Masalha is a Palestinian academic and historian. He's a professor of religion and politics at SOAS, and he's also written many books on Palestine, including the book that I have here in front, Palestine, A 4,000-Year History. So without further ado, Noor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I was a professor of religion and politics at St. Mary's University, not at SOAS. I'm attached to SOAS at the moment, but we had a brilliant session this afternoon with Ilan, and Ilan gave an excellent talk, and then everybody came in, and everybody seems to know the answer, or seems to have agreed with Ilan. He actually wasn't quizzed at all, so I hope you will quiz us this evening. And Ilan and I share an awful lot in common, actually, but we might have a debate, which would be a good idea. Why Palestine is still the issue for us Palestinians? It's obvious, isn't it? The interesting question is why Palestine is becoming more and more a global issue, not just a British issue, not just an issue affecting British politics and the centre of British politics, if you like, but it's really a global issue. And Jared Kushner, you know Jared Kushner?
Thank God.
In the run-up to his Bahrain conference, you think this guy actually would be preparing for a conference in Bahrain to make it successful. So he actually gave an interview to a newspaper saying Palestinians actually can't govern themselves. So we can't govern ourselves. I think to actually kick off a conference like that with the statement that we are not capable of governing ourselves, and therefore he is going to try to govern Palestine for us. And this was followed by a piece in the New York Times by the Israeli ambassador to the UN, adding further that Palestinians, well, why Palestinians are not surrendering, he says. He says, well, what's wrong with surrendering for the Palestinians? In fact, surrendering now will be less costlier than actually submission in the future. I mean, you can see the arrogance of these two people and the arrogance of two racist individuals and two supporters of settler colonialism. Kushner is a contributor, he's a personally financial contributor to the settlements actually. He's on record for being one of those people actually giving money. The Israeli ambassador to the UN went further, explaining that the two-state solution is dead. That there's only one state between the river and the sea. That the Palestinians actually should give in now. I mean, here, this idea that there's only one state between the river and the sea, and that the Palestinians have got nothing to look for, nothing to fight for, and only to surrender is absurd. We, the Palestinians, haven't surrendered now for the last 100 years. Why would we want to surrender now, after 100 years? It's just the absurdity of these people, and we will never surrender. I mean, this is not a Churchillian, actually. Churchill is not a cup of tea for me as a historian. But you can see what happened to the Bahrain conference, and the Bahrain conference was a total failure. It failed mainly because the Palestinians boycotted it. In fact, for the first time in years, Palestinians united around the Bahrain conference actually and boycotted the conference. And the conference was attended by a number of Arab countries, Arab regimes, including regimes from Morocco, from Egypt, but the Palestinians completely, totally, the whole, and the conference was a total utter failure. And so who says that boycott and BDS doesn't work? It does work. The answer to the question why Palestine is becoming more and more a global issue, and why Palestine is also becoming in the center of British politics, and why Jeremy Corbyn threat to recognize that it's actually so intimidating. So it's a moral gesture, but it's really the BDS. It's the BDS which is growing. It's the BDS which was at the heart of Brisbane actually only a couple of weeks ago. Brisbane is a fairly conservative Middle East association, and membership actually voted for BDS. And then the Council of Brisbane said, well, we're not there, we are going to distance ourselves. So this is probably part of the answer. I actually want to begin with a couple of books I wrote in the mid-70s. At the height of the Oslo process, I published a couple of books. One is called Expulsion of Palestinians, 92, 93, and then Ilan Without a People in 97. At the time when so many Palestinians were fairly, not euphoric, but optimistic about the situation. And when my colleague and friend Ilan Pappé said, well, let's try to make the best of it. At the time, in the mid-90s, I said, forget about it. I said the Israeli strategy on the end Palestine and West Bank is not two-state solution. The Israeli strategy is maximum land, minimum Arabs. And this idea of maximum land, minimum Arabs actually was published in a book I published in 1997. It came in the Arabic edition of that book in Beirut. At the same time, more or less, actually, it's a conception, it's a strategy developed by labor Zionism in the mid-30s. Zionism is about maximizing the land, maximum geography, and minimum Arabs in the Jewish state. It was implemented more or less in 1948, fewer Arabs in the Jewish state, and they managed to clear out nearly more than half of the Palestinians. They occupied 80% of Palestine, and the Palestinians within the Green Line in 1949, they were actually 13%. Today they are 20%, but they were 13%. So it was fairly implemented, that concept, and after 67 actually it was incremental, if you like. It was trying to push the Palestinians, and they tried to encourage Palestinian immigration from Gaza. In fact, the Israeli strategy after 67 was actually to annex Gaza and to try to have a Palestinian autonomy on the West Bank. It's the failure, the demographic failure to settle Gaza. The Israelis ended up with about 7,000 settlers, but Gaza has got 2 million Palestinians. This is exactly the same strategy which Sharon implemented in 2005. The fact that they could not settle Gaza, they could not annex Gaza. Gaza has got 2 million Palestinians. Most of our refugees from the area, from Tel Aviv, the fact that demographically Gaza was overwhelming in Palestinians, by unilaterally, Sharon decided in 2005 actually to pull out of Gaza and to dismantle Israeli settlements in 2005, about 7,000 from Gaza, by getting rid of 2 million Palestinians and giving up a tiny proportion of Palestine. Gaza is about less than 1% of historic Palestine. In fact, this is exactly a maximum land, minimum Arabs. In fact, the Israelis treat their border between them and Gaza as an international border. There was no even suggestion to go back to Gaza. It's not a border, by the way. It's a fence. It's a wall. It's another wall. But for them, they talk, you hear them talking about actually there is a border, international border between us and Gaza. They got rid of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. So the strategy on the West Bank, more or less, is trying to maximize, expand what they describe as Area C, according to Oslo, and to try to take the concentration of Palestinians in the cities, police released by the Palestinian Authority. Incidentally, Oslo collapsed about 20 years ago, by the way. In 2000, 2002, Oslo collapsed. The only thing which didn't collapse about the Oslo is the security collaboration between the PA and Israel. That's still there, that's still going on. This is the money which Trump did not even cut. He cut all the money to the Palestinians, to the refugees, to the aid. He did not cut security collaboration money. In fact, we had the Palestinian, the head of the PLO speaking at Exeter about 2 weeks ago. He said, I met 4 American generals in Jericho. Still that collaboration between the PA policing the cities. Israel is expanding, maximizing its geography, maximizing settlement annexation, is carving up the West Bank. That's the Israeli strategy in the West Bank. Is not one, hang on a second, let me just sum up the whole thing. It's not one-state solution, it's not two-state solution. The Israeli strategy is no state solution for the Palestinians. We shouldn't be having illusions about that. The destruction of the so-called two-state solution scenario, in fact, doesn't lead from Israeli point automatically, and from the point of Trump, and from the point to a one-state solution for the Palestinians. I know an awful lot of us actually would like to see that vision, and I'm sure we will develop it further. And Ilan and I would all disagree on that sort of thing. But the Israeli strategy is also to try to prevent the creation of a joint Israeli-Palestinian state, Jewish-Arab state. And the nationality law of 2018, last year, was actually aimed at the Palestinians in Israel, 20% of the population. And they tried to consolidate, in fact, actually tried to minimize or marginalize the Palestinians within the Green Line. So when we talk about satellite colonialism, Zionist satellite colonialism as opposed to British colonialism in India, in fact, actually we talk about internal satellite colonialism, which is going on within the Green Line. The nationality law last year was one component of it. And also satellite colonialism on the West Bank basically is about consolidating, expanding Israeli. It looks like more and more like apartheid. One guy this afternoon objected to the word apartheid and Bantustans. It's beginning to look like, more like. In 1948, they tried to clear out the Palestinians to prevent the creation of an apartheid state. But Israel is becoming more and more, in fact, looking like an apartheid state, including West Bank and Gaza. And I think this is far worse than South African apartheid. I'm going to stop here, because I've been ordered, yeah? So I'll come back to some of these things if people wish to develop them, and thank you so much.
I've just heard you speak for about 5 times that length. So our next speaker is Anne Alexander. Anne Alexander is co-editor of the Middle East Solidarity magazine and also of Palestine, Resistance, Revolution and the Struggle for Freedom.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honour to speak on the platform with Noor and Ilan tonight. I think we will all be agreeing about a number of things, but I think there may be some slight differences in the way we approach this, because the point that I would like to emphasise in my short contribution is really speaking as a revolutionary socialist, trying to put the question of Palestine into a broader perspective around revolutionary politics in the Middle East, and coming at it from somebody who isn't Palestinian, but has been involved in standing in solidarity with the Palestinians, but also standing in solidarity and organising in solidarity with revolutionaries and activists across the Middle East, more broadly in the Arab world, who have been fighting against some of the regimes which have for decades, in many cases, professed very hypocritically to be on the side of the Palestinians. And the first thing that I really want to say here really is that the Palestinians' amazing courage and resilience, their steadfastness. There's actually a word in Arabic which is incredibly difficult to translate, a samud, which is usually translated as steadfastness, but you try and put that into a petition, it's actually really quite difficult. And I want to really start from, where does this come from? Where does this resilience, this courage keep coming back from? Why is it that Palestinian resistance runs through the wider politics of the region like a red, white, green and black thread? The 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. It's there in the mass politics of the region, and not just in the gyrations of the diplomats and the statesmen, even then with the more radical Arab leaders in the 1950s like Gamal Abdel Nasser. And then through the 1960s and 70s and into the 1980s, it comes back erupting with the first Intifada in 1987, which of course started in Gaza, and then saw a ripple effect across the region with protests against, not against the, using similar tactics in places like Algeria and Jordan over austerity measures that were there, and the IMF and the World Bank trying to push through economic reforms. And then you come into the 2000s, where actually, again, the second Intifada had a ripple effect across the region, with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in the face of huge repression. And in many cases, in countries like Egypt in particular, it was those protests that really fed into. They are the precursors of the great storm which erupted in 2011 and the revolution that took place there and led to the downfall of the dictator Hosni Mubarak. And one of the questions I want to explore here is, why is it that the rise of independent Arab states in the 1950s and 60s didn't solve the problem for the Palestinians of being excluded? Why was it that they were unable to, despite their courage and resistance, despite the armed struggle that was waged by organisations like Fatah and then by the other armed factions of the Palestinian resistance? Why, despite the support of the newly independent Arab states, or the ones that had seemed to have shaken off the shackles of colonialism like Egypt or Algeria, why did that not lead to a fundamental change in the regions? And how could we see the kind of change that would bring about real liberation, not just for the Palestinians, but also for people across the region, from the corrupt and authoritarian regimes that oppressed them, and also from the impact of imperialism? And actually that phrase, imperialism, is really where I want to focus on, to think about what role it is that Israel plays in Israel's occupation of Palestinian land, Israel's exclusion of Palestinian land, the building of this ethnocracy, this militarized encampment in the middle of the Middle East. What is the purpose of that in a wider system of imperialism? And this is, of course, something which, as Noor has already alluded to, has very deep roots back in the days when Britain was the major imperial power. You go back to the time of the Balfour Declaration, of the promises that were made by the British ruling class to the Zionist leaders, of their very hypocritical support for a Zionist settler colonial project, so that it would create what they called like a loyal little Jewish Ulster. That was the words of Ronald Storrs, who was one of the architects of the British policy in Palestine. That it would have a minority in a much wider population who couldn't be trusted, the wider peoples of the Middle East, the British diplomats and officials at the time felt were not like them enough. There is a huge legacy of racism and colonialism, a colonial mentality there, which has persisted into the architecture of the Israeli state. And what they envisaged then was this entity that would come into being, that would be utterly and totally in support of British interests in the region. Now, of course, actually, as we know, the British Empire waned, despite the fact it was supposed to be the empire in which the sun never set. The sun set on the British Empire, and that was a good thing. And the reason the sun set on it was not simply because of the rise of new economic powers like the US and so on. It was also because it was consigned to the dustbin of history by mass struggles, by the mass wave of anti-colonial rebellions which shook the Middle East in the 1940s, and of course the rest of the British Empire. But who came into the frame then was actually the rise of the US. which took over that role and again nurtured Israel as the watchdog for its military, political and economic interests. However, US policy has never relied simply on Israel alone in the region. It has always relied on one or two other regional powers that, again, it has cultivated a relationship with. And these have shifted from time to time. So in the 1970s, before 1979, Iran was a major pillar of this policy. Then that was bit the dust, really, in an enormous popular uprising that overthrew the US-friendly government and instituted and eventually brought to power the Islamic Republic. These days, we see, actually, I would argue, essentially a kind of four-pillar architecture of imperialism in the region, where you have the rise of powers like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states around it as a very important node of capital accumulation in the region. The Gulf is a hugely dynamic centre of the regional economy, and this is why Jared Kushner is in Bahrain. I mean, it's not the only reason he's in Bahrain. He's in Bahrain because Bahrain's compliant, corrupt, authoritarian monarchy is very happy to give him a platform. But he's there in the Gulf because the whole plan that he's laying out relies on the US building up and supporting these rising powers in the region, rising economic powers, who are also, of course, military recipients of massive military aid. And then you also have actually other rising powers in the region, to a certain extent, Iran, although Iran is locked in this conflict with the US, and may well be a target of US aggression in future. Iran has become a much more powerful player in the region, and then Turkey as well, another important factor. But where does Israel fit into this? Because Israel, I think, has a special place to play in the region. Israel is, as the British colonial officials envisaged, has this special character of being a remaining link to the settler colonial past, and that is integrated, for example, into the US economy militarily. Its industries are particularly the ones that are the most profitable, such as for example, in terms of IT, high-tech industry, which are incubated by the Israeli army and incubated through this collaboration with the US. It's no longer the case that Israel is a kind of basket case propped up by US handouts. Actually, its economy has leapt forward, but this is not because of some start-up spunk of the Israeli character. It is to do with massive subsidies that have flowed into the economy. So, in the remaining couple of minutes, I want to then say, what does this mean in terms of resistance and in terms of strategy for how we can see getting rid of not just the Israeli occupation, but the whole architecture of imperialism that sustains it. And this is where I think the weak point is in the plans that have been laid out by US officials over the decades, is that Palestine remains the issue for vast numbers of people in the much wider region, because it sits at the crux between economic and political struggles. It sits in there because they can see that the people who are selling the Palestinians down the river, if you are a factory worker in somewhere like Masalha in Al-Kubra in Egypt, or somebody in Algeria who's facing the impact of massive cuts and austerity on the crumbling public services. The people who are selling the Palestinians down the river are also the ones that are trashing your lives. And that Palestine keeps coming back because it sits in that space between politics and economics in the region. That people know that when they go into the streets with the Palestinian flag, as in fact has happened on the massive protests in Algeria over the last few weeks, that their own generals, the ones who pretend to be anti-imperialist, the ones who use that rhetoric of fighting colonialism in the past, are the ones that are sending the police in to try and arrest people for waving the Palestinian flag. And I think that actually has implications for strategy. The kind of strategy that relies on building an independent Palestinian state in isolation from the struggles to change the region from below, is one that I think has time and time run into the sand, has run into the disaster of the Oslo peace process, has run into capitulation time and time again. It is only by reasserting that connection back to the struggle to change the Middle East as a whole, through the liberation of its peoples by its people, by getting rid of the whole lot of them at the top, as the Algerian protests tend to put it, that orientation of the Palestinian struggle around that axis is the surest way to undo the plans of people like Kushner and Trump and anyone who comes after them.
Ilan Pappé is a historian from Exeter, and he's also the author of many books on Palestine, including The Ethnic Cleansing of the Palestinians and The Biggest Prison on Earth. Thank you, Ilan.
Thank you.
Good. Now I'm tagged. Good. Palestine, I came across this idea of Palestine as still the issue twice. Two instances when I thought about this sentence. One when John Pilger had a film which was called Palestine is Still the Issue. And this was less a statement as a wishful thinking. And the proof of this was that he was sure that Channel 4 would broadcast this very important and instrumental documentary film at prime time, at 9 o'clock, but then they moved it to midnight, if you remember. So I said to him, Palestine is still the issue at midnight. We have to move, Palestine has to be the issue at 9 o'clock, not at midnight. But the second time I came across this, I thought about this idea, I was in Buenos Aires, and the trade unions came to me and said, will you be willing to speak? There's a huge demonstration of teachers. The teachers in Buenos Aires demonstrated for 3 days. They even built a model school at the time. And I said, I can't speak Spanish. He said, never mind, speak in English. I said, but there will be a translation, right? He said, no. Okay. I said, okay. You know, most people in Argentina don't speak English. So there I was speaking in English to 10,000 people. 100 of them understood what I said. But whenever I said Palestina, they suddenly, out of nowhere, all of them waved the Palestinian flags in a demonstration for raising the salaries of teachers in the whole of Argentina. And then suddenly you realize I could have quoted from the phone directory in Buenos Aires, but if I mention Palestine enough times, they will understand what's the connection between me and their struggle. And that was very powerful. And I think it tells you that Palestine is still the issue for several reasons. Some of them were already mentioned by the excellent contribution before. And I just want to deal with them maybe from a different angle. One issue that was already mentioned, but I think has to be highlighted, that in Palestine is still under settler colonial regime that has not yet been defeated, but you cannot say it's already fully successful. And that's very different from other settler colonial situations. Yes, Native Americans are still fighting, and we all support them. So do the First Nations and the Aboriginals and the Maoris. This is all true. But there is a difference, and we know that this difference has to do with historical timing. It has to do with the issue of sovereignty and independence, which are not at the agenda of most anti-settler colonial movement. So it's one of these very unique situations where it's a 19th century project that is incomplete. It's still incomplete. And I think that really attracts a lot of attention, and we should use it, because that means the fight is not lost. The second issue, second point, and they're equally important. I'm not enumerating them according to importance, just according to how I'm thinking about it. The post-colonial world, as they say, is not much to write home about. colonialist secret service were replaced by the liberated secret service. So before you were tortured by a French man, now you're tortured by an Algerian, but you're still being tortured for freedom of speech and freedom of organization. The lands were liberated, but not the people, as we know, and the Arab Spring was kind of a challenge to that. It's not surprising that we are all, those of us who live there, those of us who live in the Arab world, and even beyond, in Africa and so on, say maybe once we will have one post-colonial project which would respect human rights, which respects civil rights, would be the model we are dreaming for ourselves, not just for the people who are colonized, which you can't say on most of the Arab states. You can't say on most of the African states. And to be honest, you can't even say about post-apartheid South Africa with the economic apartheid still going on there. So I think there is this energy that we should tap into, of, especially among young people, sort of looking at this and say, wait a minute, this can still be molded. This liberation can still be built. It's not over. It's not like you have, and nobody, I mean, that's the greatest success of all of us. Nobody looks at the PA as a nation state, thank God. Nobody thinks that the Palestinian Authority is the government of the liberated Palestinians. In that respect, thank God that Oslo has crashed so dramatically on that point, because it means we all can still hope for building something different on the spot. There's another issue which I think puts Palestine within the perspective of this idea of Palestine is still the issue, and this is securitization. I don't know if you know, but Israel's biggest export industries is securitization. And it took time for African Americans who were very late in coming supporting the Palestinians. You remember, we were in the United States. We couldn't even succeed in convincing the Afro-American lobby groups to join us in the first one-state conference we had. Everyone else came, but this, we are not sure that this is a good topic and so on. But once they understood the connection between places like Ferguson and the Israeli military industry and the security industry and the connection between profiling that was invented in Israel and the profiling in the United States, where suddenly you see that the United States is the dog that the tail is wagging. I mean, that it's all, you go to any security project in the US, whether it's an airport, whether it's a school, whether it's a university, whether it's any kind of a public space, the chief advisors are Israeli security generals. They have all kinds of beautiful, kind of heroic Aryan Israeli names, and Barak, and so on. And it suddenly people who are under the boot of the oppression of the American police, the FBI, see that this is strongly, organically connected to the export of security strategy, methodology that comes from Tel Aviv and the rest of Israel. And sometimes, and that's our hope, there is an overspill. The Israelis are overdoing it, as they did in Belgium, when they wanted to, in Belgium universities, the great Israeli expert of security wanted to train the Belgian police and secret service in the universities how to deal with the Muslim minority in Belgium in the fight against terror. And that these, every now and then they exceed what they even think they can do, and there was good backlash, and they were thrown out of the universities. It doesn't always happen in Belgium, but they were thrown out of the university. But I think that sort of brings Palestine as an issue of what securitization means to political and economic elites in our time, and why Palestine is such a huge laboratory for this experiences of regimes of how to suppress mass demonstrations, small demonstrations, demonstrations with women, demonstrations with children. Shir Hever wrote a brilliant book showing how even the sniper rifles that the Israelis are now using in the Gaza Strip they keep changing the sniper rifle with which they kill the demonstrators, because according to prospective buyers around the world, because they need to film them to show if they are effective enough. And they did the same with the weapons they used already in the 2006 assault, in the 2009 assault. There's a clear graph between an Israeli assault on Gaza and the rise in Israeli arms sales a few months after, because everything is being filmed, sent to prospective buyers, some of them in the Arab world, and then everybody buys them. So Palestine is still the issue there, and I will finish by saying that I think that although the youthquake, so to speak, of 2008, both here in the rest of the world and in the Arab world, seemed to end in disarray without any change in political realities, we are historians. We are not impressed by 11 years of failure and stating that this youthquake has ended. It has not ended, and for young people in Palestine and outside of Palestine, Palestine is even more the issue, again, because it has this potential for a different reality. Not because the present reality matters, because you are, as a young person, should imagine a different reality, should work for a different reality, and not be dismayed by old dinosaurs like us, who after 35 years are a bit exhausted and would like to retire. Thank you.
I think I've managed to kind of get a mic working.
I very much liked Ilan's description at the last meeting that because the message was so toxic after the 80s in Israel, what Israel's focused on is shooting the messenger rather than trying to defeat the message. But of course, in many ways, it's worked. Although there's no question that boycotting has really worked. In many cases, people who want to fight back have really felt it very, very difficult and have retreated. I work in a staff room with 3 Muslims who have various different conspiracy theories, and none of them will actually even sponsor me when I go on the cycle ride for some reason. I also work with a Palestinian, a Christian Palestinian, who actually says some very strange things about Gaza. I think there are still some PA supporters among the Palestinians, and he's one of them, unfortunately. So obviously, the situation isn't entirely good. However, I think there's a real undercurrent of people who are really angry, especially among young people, really fed up with all of the argument about anti-Semitism. It's very simple. You go into a cafe wearing anything like this, and they want to know everything about it. And I've just come from Pal Expo, where we've got a stall, and I tell you, there's an awful lot of people who've done the ride already who want to do it more. So all I'm saying is, obviously, that's not the whole answer. We need something that pushes back, which can actually show that there are people who say it's right to support Palestine. We don't accept the arguments. But last year, we had about 200 people coming down Edgware Road, led by 4 sisters from Newham, 4 Newham sisters, and they are sisters from Newham, chanting at the front, Palestine, etc., etc., and there wasn't one car that dared not beep its horn as it went up. The spirit that these things can actually start is fantastic. So if you are at all interested and are capable of coming on a bike ride on 27th, and if not, just buy this shirt. One in London, and one in Manchester.
Thank you to all the speakers. They're all really interesting and thought-provoking discussions. I want to particularly underline what Anne talked about, though, about the relationship between Palestine and the rest of the Middle East, or the wider region. Anne puts it much more theoretically than I do, but I just think we need to draw out these relationships. We come across thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands on occasion, who are in Britain, who are outraged on a moral level about what's happening to Palestinians, about journalists, clearly marked as journalists, being shot and all the rest of it. And quite rightly, people are outraged by that. But we need to, as socialists, we need to sort of put a strategy about what kind of thing could win for the Palestinians. And I always come back to the road to liberation for Palestine goes through Cairo. I think when we saw the Egyptian revolutions, we actually had a situation where there were people in Palestine demonstrating and celebrating the Egyptian revolution. The Egyptian socialists and activists were able to cross over, because of course it borders with Gaza. Yeah, for the first time go over into Gaza and visit and show their support for Palestinians. You know, with the counter-revolution in Egypt, that's, you know, all been rolled back, and I think, you know, as far as I understand it, sympathisers with Palestine are now, you know, under suspicion within Egypt as well, and they can't cross over into Palestine anymore. So I think we need to raise that issue of the importance of revolution in the Middle East, and I think that strikes a chord with people that we come across in Britain who are supporting Palestine.
Yeah, I want to talk about building solidarity inside trade unions, and at the moment how it is becoming harder because of the backtracking over the anti-Semitism row inside the Labour Party. And I think this will be increasingly the case inside the trade unions. My own union, the journalist union, the NUJ, I think we're the only one in the country, perhaps across the world, that hasn't actually supported the BDS campaign. And our union leaders have always argued that if we took a position on Israel, then that would be a death warrant. That would be, journalists would be put in danger in Israel. You know, the fact that they are in danger now, not facing up to a bully, and not thinking about the consequences to the Palestinians, you know, by us not taking a stand, seems to have passed them by. Because I remember we did take a stand against the South African state, which was threatening journalists. We did support the anti-apartheid movement, you know, and but, you know, that was a really good position for journalists to take, because journalists should take sides. Our duty is to the truth, not to the interests of the Israeli state, or, you know, how they're going to try and treat journalists, because you know, it really is going to be a hard one. But I've got an example of how we can come through that, and it's a bit of an example like we did around supporting the anti-apartheid movement, was through direct links, direct action. It may be more difficult, but now a group in the town where I live, Sheffield Palestinian Campaign, had come across a group of journalists in Gaza, and they want to make links with us. So in my union branch, South Yorkshire branch, we've now set up a little project where we're going to kind of twin, or, you know, start regular links. We had a Skype link a few weeks ago. It was absolutely fantastic. 2 hours Skype link where they were telling us just how difficult it is, not just to be a journalist and tell the truth, but to actually live because of the travel restrictions, all those things, horrors. You know, I'm sure people are familiar with what I'm saying. But I think those direct links can build the solidarity and can undermine the backlash over the anti-Semitism. Right? We should go on the offensive and call out what's happening in Gaza, call out what Israel's doing. That's the way to beat the right wing and push them back, and start to defend people like Chris Williamson, who spoke the other night.
Brilliant.
Hi, I'm Selma. I'm from an activist in France. Just to raise a question, we often, you know, when we create like fronts on specific issues like Palestine, we can be confronted with people who not always share the same analysis about the region. Yet you could put them, how is it possible to put them aside when concretely you engage in solidarity? I'm giving the example of France, because, how should I say, I would be more precise. For example, you can be involved in a pro-Palestine campaign with people who don't think that what's been happening in Syria is a revolution, or could be pro-Assad, or could be pro, you know, dictatorship. And yet they've been very active in Palestine solidarity. They have this very precise, you know, view on how solidarity should be made, and see Palestine as a single entity. But at the same time, I would like to give the example of France, because today in France, well, there's been many demonstrations during the Gaza war in 2009. 2014 demonstrations been forbidden, and we pushed against the ban and forced to demonstrate. But since then, despite the growing attacks from the Israeli state, there is a real difficulty from the Palestine solidarity movement to keep on, you know, having massive demonstration, protest, For example, in Paris, the mayor of Paris has inaugurated a place of Jerusalem, but didn't invite any. She invited Israeli officials, but she didn't invite at all Palestinian officials. So, and it means something in the context. Just to be short, so why is now the movement much weaker? I think part of it is also linked to the fact that people, just to be short, like got confused because since the revolution in the region started, there has to be put forward some argument. I'm giving just one example. I think it was also important not only being part of this movement, but maybe also arguing solidarity with other processes in the region that also include Palestinians. There are Palestinians in Syria, there are many issues like this, and in 2014 it was also important to give a clear analysis of the whole region, because both the question of the solidarity between the single entity of Palestine and the region, the whole process is very much linked.
Thank you. Next speaker is hand up.
Thank you, Anne, for talking a little bit about how the relationship between Israel and the West has shifted. And I noticed, Ilan, you also used the expression about the tail wagging the dog. And I'm up in Edinburgh, and I've been involved or helping get the film Witch Hunt, which is about the demonisation of Jackie Walker and the anti-Semitism campaign against the Labour Party. And so we've been organising some showings. This is the film, by the way, that Chris Williams arranged a room in Westminster to show it, and that was the beginning of his demonisation. But anyway, when we're showing Witch Hunt, one of the things that happened in the debates and the discussions afterwards is that people began to talk more and more about the securitization industry, etc., and how Israelis are everywhere. And it begins to shift into rather uncomfortable, beginning to sound like the Jewish global conspiracy, the way people talk about it. And, you know, we argue against it, etc., but it's definitely there, this easy slip. So I'd be interested if you could maybe, people on the panel, say just a little bit more about how Israel is the junior partner and not the powerful setting, it's not the agent setting the agenda.
Thank you. Our next speaker is just over here in the blue t-shirt.
I love the story about the Argentinian teachers, because whenever you're on a workers' demonstration or a demonstration around a so-called economic issue or something, and you see a Palestinian flag, it's so heartening, because it tells you not just that Palestine's not forgotten, but that these people are not just fighting over what's right in front of their noses, they're looking to some extent at the bigger picture. And I think that's really important to assert right now, because there's obviously people giving ground because of the anti-Semitism claims and things, but also there's an argument starting to come up that Palestine in particular, and anti-imperialism in general, is irrelevant to workers. I think like Paul Mason's column this week really epitomised that, where he said essentially worrying about imperialism is some obsession of Stalinists from the past and is silly and we don't need to do anything about it. And I think we need to assert internationalism not just as a principle, but as one of the core principles of the workers' movement and of when it wins. I mean, obviously people made the comparison with the anti-apartheid struggle and the solidarity with that. What kept coming to my mind was the support for the revolts against slavery in the 19th century. You know, Manchester, at the same time, and Greater Manchester in general, was the absolute heartland of the Chartist movements and the general strikes and the British working class at its best. It was also the heartland of the anti-slavery movement, where those same workers fighting for their own interests packed out meeting halls, signed petitions, a fifth of the city's population signed petitions against slavery. Those two things weren't a coincidence. You know, as Marx wrote at the time, labour in a white skin cannot be free as long as labour in a black skin is branded with slavery. And I think, you know, those causes are what make us worthy of winning, and what allows us to win is that internationalism, that solidarity. And I think that it was actually really thought-provoking the way the speakers put it, that Israel is now both this hangover of 19th century colonialism, and through its security industries, its military development of technology, one of the driving forces of 21st century imperialism. It is that cause for our time. And workers do recognise that, I think, especially when they fight, and we cannot cede that territory or that principle, or what is the point of any of it?
Yeah.
We cannot allow the fear, and that's what it is, that's what they're trying to do. The fear of anti-Semitism has to be smashed. Locking 800 children up, Palestinian children, dragging them out of their homes. 800 are locked up in Israel. And the Israeli strategy now is to shoot the medics and the people at the fence in Gaza in the leg so as that they won't die outright. I spoke to a young doctor recently who was shot in both legs. They have no antibiotics. It is ridiculous to say that because you criticise Israel and the inhumanity, the absolute inhumanity, I'd ask all of you to get courage to stand up and smash it. It's an absolute lie. We're talking about children, we're talking about people that have absolutely nothing. And the other thing is, try and go to Palestine. Try to go and see what it's like on the ground. It is horrific. Thank you.
Hi. I live in Berlin. I already gave in the last explanation of the difficulty we're having in the Palestine movement in Germany. I'm not going to do that again. Just something that I've noticed both in this meeting and the previous one that Ilan gave, that despite the horrific, the horror of what's happening, and despite what they were saying about the natural support that people have for Palestine, you do seem to be having difficulties in sustaining an active Palestine solidarity movement there. In a way, Palestine is the issue, I think, in the same way that South Africa was the issue in the 1980s, and during the 1980s there was a sustained, for a number of years, actions around boycott and things like that. And firstly, I'd like to know if this is, but please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me you've got a vibrant movement which is doing all sorts of things and being successful. Second, there's certainly something we're experiencing in Germany, to the extent that the horror in Palestine, especially in Gaza, is somehow becoming normalised. That when there was a big bombing attack on Lebanon, when there were the two big bombing attacks on Gaza, it was possible to mobilise all sorts of people who thought by demonstrating for the Palestinians, for the people suffering in Gaza, we can make a difference. We can go out in a demonstration. Whereas at the moment, you sort of get the feeling, because it's happening every day, because there's a Gaza March of Return, and then every day you see people being shot, every day you see people being killed. The people who, apart from the Palestine professionals who do this just because they've got nothing else to do, to a degree, there's a degree difficulty in mobilisation. The question, is this the case? And if so, then how do we break that through? I mean, how... As I remember, I'm old enough to remember the anti-apartheid movement, that we found all sorts of creative ways of actions at supermarkets, actions at embassies, and things like things like that, to put not just the South African government now, but also our own government under pressure for the complicity of what's there. I know people should go to Palestine, and much better we should organise anyone who goes to Palestine around to speak, to tell everyone they know about what's happening there. We should organise Palestinian speakers, particularly young Palestinian speakers, to speak in schools and things like that today. But what are the possibilities at the moment of an active campaign which goes from the general revulsion people feels about what the Israeli government's going, to a general feeling I'm getting in the last two meetings that the level of activity isn't as high as it should be?
Right, I've got the comrade just at the very back.
I think to try and answer the previous comrade's comment about why we're having difficulties in Britain, there's a number of reasons, but I think the shrinking of the size of the anti-war movement at the first start went up 2001 to about 2005, then went down, got smaller. We have had bursts of Palestinian solidarity demonstrations in 2006 and 2009. not on the same level as the demonstrations against the Iraq war, but there were still big demonstrations. And then in 2014, but they went smaller again. And there's been an overall trajectory of the anti-war movement, which does link into the Palestinian question, and it's been shrinking since the mid-noughties. Not completely. I mean, it's been going up and down a bit, but overall shrinking. But you've also got the intensification of Islamophobia, and even though they often don't say it overtly, many people in this country who support the Palestinians are Muslim. Muslims, particularly people of colour, I would say, black and Asian Muslims. I'm guessing possibly more. I mean, there are plenty of white people who do support the Palestinians, but I would say, in terms of demonstrations I've been on, it was noticeable, and I think, to be honest, the whole way they've tried to push a climate of suspicion against Muslims, as supposedly being, a threat, terrorism, blah, 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 and also anti-Semitism. They've been using that as well. So, and that's bled into the whole, smearing the whole Palestinian solidarity movement, as well as being, racist against Muslims, making stereotypes about what they are assumed to believe in. I think it's kind of, directly and indirectly, it's affecting the confidence, and people, rather than stand up to people trying to smear and stand up to Islamophobia and stand up against imperialism and colonialism. I mean, it's true to say that one more bit. It's true to say around the edges of the movement that you do occasionally hear anti-Semitic comments, and they should be challenged whenever you hear them. But that doesn't... Most of this going on by the mainstream press is smears, and it's been getting worse since 2002. So really, I think it's this decline of the anti-war movement, the shrinking of the size of it, and Islamophobia's had a big part to play in the people's increased defensiveness, and we've got to stand up against it.
Okay, thank you. Right, next speaker will be the comrade just here.
There's been a huge shift, though, in popular perceptions of Israel-Palestine. Many years ago, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, Israel was regarded as a progressive state, indeed a socialist state. In a recent poll last year, a BBC poll of 22 countries, Israel was the fourth most disliked nation in the world, behind only Iran, Pakistan and North Korea. A huge shift. So BDS works, doesn't it? To some extent, yes, it must work. Yet nothing seems to change. The situation of the Palestinians gets worse. More annexations, more land theft, more expulsions. Yet if we didn't do the slogging out, I belong to a local PSC group, and every month we stand and give out leaflets, BDS leaflets, outside Sainsbury's, urging people not to buy Israeli goods. If we didn't do that month in, month out, week in, week out, maybe the Israelis would complete the ethnic cleansing that was begun in 1948 that Ilan has written about so brilliantly. So we need to keep up that solidarity work. We need to do everything we can, because the tragedy of Palestine is that they can't liberate themselves. Despite huge courage, huge capacity for resistance, they don't have the economic power, they don't have the military power. And what Anne said was absolutely right. The liberation of Palestine depends on the liberation of the whole Middle Eastern region. Just my final point is, when Mubarak fell in 2011, I rang a Palestinian comrade of mine in Jaffa, and I said, "How do you feel?" And he said, and I'll never forget his words, "The gates of my freedom have opened." That was in 2011. Unfortunately, it all went into reverse. We know what happened after that. But let us keep up the solidarity work. Let us prevent the situation from getting even worse. Looking forward to a resurgence of the revolutionary upheavals that inspired us in 2011.
Thank you. I think something as well that needs to sort of be said, sort of tying in with the points about sort of slavery and the idea of sort of, what Marx said about it as well, is sort of making it clear that, Israel with a fascist government, a fascist premier, Netanyahu, like all fascist governments, despite, attempting to make it seem, like it's protecting the Jewish people, has nothing but contempt, for its citizens. It plays on their fears, which, are very real for them, but it does it in order to secure its power. And I think, trying to make it clear, to the Jewish community and everything, that their sort of, liberation from those fears lies with the Palestinian people as well, because Israel and its government just wants to keep them under control as well, and it wants to make, and it wants to keep them constantly under fear because that's what gives them power.
I've got a number more speakers. I'm just going to give people 2 minutes to get everybody in.
I don't know whether Sheffield is unique, but I don't recognise the description of a weak Palestine solidarity campaign. I'm here as part of that campaign with my friends who are part of the SWP. We work with Labour Friends of Palestine. We work with Stand Up to Racism. We're very strong on boycott, divestment and sanctions, and I think that is one of the big movements that everybody can join. The PSC is for everybody. It's not just for its members. Some of our friends have spent 3 days on the roof of the Elbit factory in Oldham recently, protesting at an Israeli arms factory being in Lancashire. And we're involved in an important campaign which is about stopping the JNF. We've already had 1 round of speaking talks. We've gone to a tribunal with the Charity Commission, and if any cause was going to raise the charge of anti-Semitism, it would be a campaign to stop the JNF. And yet, it hasn't raised that charge because it's rooted in a very strong narrative. So I would say the Palestine campaign is very strong, and it's rooted in the analysis of key people like those who are sitting on the panel.
Thank you. Right, next speaker is just here. Just right here. Thanks. Yeah.
Look, I don't want to underestimate the suppressive effect of the attacks on Palestinian solidarity. But there is another side to the coin which we cannot lose sight of. As we all sit here now, in this hall, the biggest Palestine convention in Europe is taking place at Pal Expo. That is a convention, by the way, that there's been a systematic attempt right up to the wire, to this very hour, to get it pulled, to get it withdrawn, and there's been a pushback and a fight to make sure that doesn't happen. And we're going to have to make sure it doesn't happen next year either. When there's combativity, the kind of spark, the touchstone that the Palestinian struggle touches on the wider struggles in the Middle East and beyond, starts to surface in a way that the advocates of the Israeli state and of American imperialism cannot handle. Look at the heart of the beast. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez names those camps for what they are, concentration camps, there was an attempt to use the anti-Semite label to silence her over the question of Palestine, but not over the question of Palestine, to defend Trump and to defend the attacks on migrants and so forth. And it was rolled back, even within the Democrat Party itself. Those who opposed Cortez have been pushed back onto the retreat. Even in Germany, where we talked earlier about the BDS, we've seen the signatories of the statement, you know, from Israeli professors and so on, who don't necessarily support even BDS, you know, pushing it back. Over the Holocaust Museum statement in Washington, where they said, you cannot compare, after Cortez's statement, you cannot compare the Holocaust in any way to anything before or since. 350 scholars, Holocaust scholars, replied, you know, and they're not the usual suspects, saying this was totally unacceptable and meant you couldn't draw any lessons from history. That is where we have to touch our activity, our politics, and our drive at every single opportunity, because there is the terrain that makes it possible to fight on the question of Palestine.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to ask 3 questions, one to each speaker. First of all, people may not know Alexandra has made herself quite an expert on both the uprisings in Algeria and Sudan. and in Sudan in particular, which is the most extraordinary struggle, which has managed to have a resurgence despite the horrific oppression 2 weeks ago. My question to Anne is, can Sudan provide the kind of lift that the region needs following the defeat of the Arab Spring? That's question number one. Question to Noor is, in many ways, the destruction of two states as a solution is fantastically interesting, because many of us have never believed a two-state solution was possible. Now the Israeli government is deciding for us it's not possible. It leaves a fantastic vacuum. Israel, despite its apparent strength, does not have the strength to do a 1948. It cannot kick the Palestinians out of the West Bank, so what's it going to do with them? But my question isn't what Israel is going to do with them, it's what the Palestinians themselves are going to do about, first of all, their rotten leadership of the Palestinian Authority, but a very simple question. Is the prospect for raising a democratic demand of one person, one vote? Yes, I'm afraid it's in the Israeli state, but if you raise that question, one person, one vote, and insisted that the refugees were included, well, the Palestinians have a majority. So it would be a fantastically interesting campaign. Is that a possibility? Question number 3 to Ilan. Just because, in case you weren't in Ilan's last meeting, towards the end of his contribution, he made a fantastically interesting point about a worldwide attempt, admittedly amongst a minority of Jews, but to put on the map an international campaign of Jewish men and women who say Israel does not speak in our name and we do not believe this synthetic anti-Semitism. So my question to Ilan is, when is that conference going to take place?
Brilliant, thank you. And then yes, at the back, you'll be next. And
Hey, thanks. I just had 2 questions. I guess I'd been reading quite a lot about how people saw the framing of the Palestinian people, kind of ranging from people saying it's not helpful to kind of have people as this kind of superhuman kind of person to kind of it's not helpful to have people as these kind of people with nothing who need us to save them and kind of everything in between. And so I was just wondering what you thought of the framing of the Palestinian people and kind of what was helpful and what wasn't. And then my other question just comes from something I was reading about. It was midwives arguing for more money to be spent on maternal health care. And they said that they regretted not arguing based on human rights basis and instead arguing because of kind of the consequences, so mental ill health or physical ill health and that kind of thing. And so I was just wondering, because I'd seen a Palestinian psychiatrist saying that she didn't think that mental health diagnoses in this case were helpful. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on kind of just purely arguing that something's kind of a human right, or do you argue kind of that it's bad because of all these other consequences to get your to kind of achieve what you want, regardless of losing the kind of human right aspect? I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a member of West Ham constituency Labour Party, and over the last year, I have to say, the anti-Semitism issue has been incredibly divisive locally. My perception is that older, I'm not Jewish by the way, but I've spoken to Jewish people in my constituency party. Some of the older members often say, well, I'm Jewish and I've been in the Labour Party for decades and I've never experienced anti-Semitism. But often the complaints, it seems to me, come from sort of younger members who are associated with the Jewish labour movement. On a personal basis, I've not had any complaints made, but I did have a little bit of a run-in last year when someone drew to my attention a Facebook post from allegedly a Labour Party member. That's what it said on their profile. And some of the comments were actually, sort of pretty violent, unacceptable. But when I articulated my point of view that this was so obviously ridiculous, I doubted this was actually a genuine Labour Party member and was probably a troll account, then I was accused of conspiracy mongering. So that's the kind of level of discussion that's happening within the Labour Party. And comrades are actually telling me that they are afraid to actually speak out on this issue now just because they know that complaints will be made against them.
right, the first speaker to come back is going to be Noor Masalha, so thank you.
Thank you. Is it just that question from John Rose, or am I allowed to comment on all sorts of things? I think just to contextualize things, when I came to the UK in the mid-80s to do my PhD, no one mentioned the word Palestine. 12 years ago, 13 years ago, when we had the first boycott conference, actually, no one mentioned the word BDS. These things are new, by the way. The BDS, actually, the way it's spread, it's a global movement. And even the PSC was, a few people actually, it was run by John, I can't remember his name actually, John G actually. It was about three, 4 people together. I remember these meetings were very, very small. It's grown to a huge movement. I think we mustn't really underestimate. Ilan was talking about actually how African Americans now are using Palestine and raising it that they didn't do 10 years ago. And partly because Israel is exporting its securitization and the globalization of the neo-global capitalism of Israel, and partly because the question of Palestine is relevant to African Americans, is relevant to the Labour Party and the direction of the Labour Party, it's relevant to the struggles of Venezuela and people, is relevant to South solidarity. Don't think that solidarity is just north-south, it's one direction from the British to the Palestinians. It's also solidarity goes from the Palestinians to the Algerians, to the Sudanese today. I mean, speaking as a Palestinian activist, actually, we have a lot of solidarity coming from Palestinians and Lebanese, mass solidarity, civil society solidarity with the Sudanese people. It's not just one-way solidarity to the poor, wretched, miserable, suffering Palestinians. We're not really, we are a bit about our future. We are also a bit about the fact that Zionism did succeed demographically. Between the river and sea, you've got 6.5 million Palestinians. In the Galilee, you have a majority of Palestinians. In the Galilee, excluding Haifa, there's a majority of Palestinians. In the Galilee, where I come from, in East Jerusalem, you have 350,000 Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem, and nearly 40% of East Jerusalem are Palestinians. People talk about the embassy, but they don't talk about how the Palestinians actually have survived. And they are surviving, and they're finding millions of ways of surviving, of struggling, and not just Samud. Samud is quite passive. In fact, Palestinians actually are active more than Samud. So the prospect for the future, long-term future, is not settled. It's not, Zionism hasn't actually succeeded to drive out the Palestinians in the way they have envisaged. Nearly 50% between the river and the sea now. Palestinians and Israeli Jews, actually, nearly 50%. And if you take 10 miles from Palestine, you have nearly 10 million Palestinians, including Jordan, by the way. It's an awful lot of Palestinians who are still there. The Jordanian government, for instance, has got a diplomatic relationship with Israel, and security, they collaborate. The vast majority of the Jordanians actually are boycotting Israel. Massive majority. The same thing applies to most Arab people are on the side of Palestinians, despite the inroads Israel is making in the Gulf with the sheikdoms and the super rich. That's something we need to remember, that the Arab societies, Arab people by the whole, on the whole, is on the side of the Palestinians. And you see the Algerian flags, as you mentioned, that in Algeria, the Palestinian flags. So I think in the long term, and the Palestinians need to have a deep breath and need to prepare for the long-term struggle. It's going to be tough, but we do learn from our own experiences, actually, that we have survived and we have fought back and we have actually achieved all sorts of things, actually. Globally, we are almost a brand, if you like. Palestinians are becoming brand, becoming quite something, something popular, something people actually raise flags. And the fact that Socialist Worker Party is raising the flag of Palestine is partly to do with the Palestinians. Partly the our struggle. It's not just your solidarity with us. It's our contribution to your struggle. You mustn't remember that. It's on all directions. So we mustn't really talk about solidarity, solidarity resistance. Resistance goes in all directions. And you need us as much as we need you. In fact, we all need each other in a globalized neoliberal capitalism in which things are interconnected. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start with the point that was raised about the question of the scale in terms of US imperialism versus Israel. I mean, I think that the comrade who sort of put it that way is right, that it is very important not to get it, not to fall into the trap of seeing somehow as Israel as having more weight in the world economy than the US. That we are talking about the Israeli ruling class is a partner with the US, but it is not on the scale of the US in terms of its importance. I totally agree with the points that Ilan and Noor have made about Israeli expertise in security and repression being marketed globally, but we have to remember the wellspring of this is the dynamics of the global economy and the role of the major imperialist powers, and we're talking about the US primarily in this context in terms of what's happening in the region. I think that's very important in the context where we actually have the horrific side of the people who are crazy anti-Semites, people who believe that the end of the world is coming, and they are in alliance with Netanyahu. I'm talking about people like Kushner, I'm talking about the evangelicals, who are in alliance with Netanyahu because they want to get rid of the Jews. They want to get rid of the Jews when the last trump sounds, no joke intended, when Armageddon happens, on the fields of Megiddo. That is why they are in alliance with people like Netanyahu. They are despicable, disgusting people. And the idea that they somehow can kind of clothe themselves in this righteousness of pretending that, you know, people who stand up for Palestinian rights are anti-Semitic. Obviously, we have to stand up and challenge anti-Semitism wherever it is. We are against anti-Semitism, we are fighting anti-Semitism, we are fighting the rise of the far right. On the point, though, that Noor just made, I absolutely agree with this idea that solidarity is reciprocal. The comrade over there asked, you know, how should we frame the Palestinians? Well, I would frame Palestinians as agents in their own liberation, and they are agents in my liberation. That they are part of this process of struggle. And this also comes on to the question of what's happening in countries like Sudan at the moment, and the revolution that is unfolding there. That in answer to John's question, do I think that revolution in Sudan will be enough to shift the balance of forces back from counter-revolution to revolution across the region? I don't know, but it is actually really starting to push the boundaries back in the right direction because of this process of people seeing that Sudanese activists are defying the military, they're defying the might of the Saudis, the Emiratis. They are sticking two fingers up to Sisi and his murderous regime, who is actually collaborating with the Saudis and the Emiratis to empower the people who want to butcher the movement in Sudan. And they are showing huge defiance, and that is enormously important. And the same can be said in terms of Algeria, but also, more to the point, can be said in terms of the beginnings and rumblings of other forms of movements. For example, in Jordan, people have mentioned Jordan, there were protests over the so-called deal of the century. There have also been long-running protests over the tax reforms, over austerity measures. That there is again this possibility of bringing together the social and the political struggles in a way that Palestine can be at that explosive centre of those contradictions in a way that can blow up in the faces of those who are in power. Or if you take Morocco, where there have been waves of protest by teachers and junior doctors, those things are the things that give us that give us hope. And I'll finish on this point about the road to liberation going through Cairo. Road to liberation of Palestine going through Cairo. Yes, that is true, but I would qualify it somewhat. I would say that actually there is this reciprocal action between the Palestinian struggle and the struggle against the states of all the states of the region, and that actually activists in those states, in places like Egypt, know that although the liberation of Palestine is dependent on them winning their victory, their liberation also depends on them standing up for Palestine, because it is the thing that, in the context like now, it can be in some cases the thing that's the spark that starts the fire, and it was in 2000. In the case of Egypt, it's very, very difficult at the moment, but historically Palestine has often played that role of being a spark in a much wider thing, a much wider set of struggles. I want to mention briefly, actually, people hopefully have been signing a petition that's been going around for Haitham Mohammedain and Hisham Fouad. who are two revolutionary activists who are in jail at the moment in Egypt and who have played a really key role in mobilising for Palestine. They understand about this reciprocal action, which is one of the reasons why the Egyptian regime wants to jail and silence them. And I think that's the perspective that we have, that Palestinians are agents of their own liberation and they are agents of ours.
Yes, about the danger of slipping into conspiracy theories about Israel's dominant role in the world, I think the best way of avoiding it is just to know the facts and be precise. Let people judge how influential they are. You don't have to assess it. But you know, when a minister from Israel comes to Belgium after a terrorist attack there and says on television, I've met the Prime Minister of Belgium and I explained to him that we can advise him how to deal with Muslim terrorists because we have millions of them in our country. It doesn't show you the impact of Israel on the one hand, but it shows you the ambition. And I think that ambition is important because Israel, that was David Ben-Gurion's idea. If Israel doesn't have this global impact, it cannot survive. So it's not a matter of whether it's factually right only, but this is part of the Israeli understanding of how you can keep, in Samuel Huntington's ideas, the Western bastion against the sea of barbarism in the Middle East. So I think that's the important context, rather than whether it's right or wrong. Yes, I think Phil's sort of pessimistic assessment was dealt with by Noor. Phil, if you would have told me 10 years ago that universities in America, forget about Britain, would have an apartheid week, that the Israeli ambassador doesn't dare to go to most American campuses because he would be jeered, or that the BDS campaign would be so successful, I would ask you, which pill have you taken? Phil. Would have made a song out of it. Pill and the Phil. Phil and the pill, rather. So we have to see the full half of the glass, and you and I are not that tall. We can see that. So let's not forget about these issues. I think there's something else which is correct, and therefore the comparison to South Africa is difficult. There was no internet in the days that the ANC was supported. You had to be on the street. You had to be active in the demonstration. Young people sometimes, and unfortunately there was the demise of the Arab Spring among other things, sometimes mistake the cyberspace for real life. And it's very difficult to convince them that organizations such as trade unions and parties are the tools of making revolutions, not a blog and not an SMS on the iPhone. It's difficult, and one can understand the disgust that some of them feel about institutions, because the institutions they know are quite corrupt. As I said once in a talk in Cairo to some of the activists, you are people who found the good water, and you want to carry it to the people who need it, but you don't believe in bottles. So you carry the water with your hands, and you're surprised that the water ran through your fingers. If you don't have bottles, I don't care. Take other containers. And in Palestine, we have the same issue. Either you join the Fatah and the Hamas and the existing political powers and you change them from within, or you create new parties, or you create new organizations. But if you think that you can do it without organizations, you're totally wrong. This is not how you're going to change reality. Two final points. There is also Palestinian agency, and that relates to John's question to you, which you nicely evaded. Not, I know. I mean, you missed it. Because you support the one. He supports the one-state solution for ages. Yeah.
I never evade questions.
No, I know you don't. John, we launched a week ago in Haifa. We launched the One Democratic State campaign. We called it campaign, not movement, because we don't want to overrate what we are doing. But the two interesting things we learned in this launch, we called it soft launch, so not to be too ambitious. One is, we don't need yet to go to the Jewish public in Israel. They are not our constituents. We need to talk to the Palestinians. Because if the Palestinians would adopt the one-state solution as an official position, much of what we're discussing today would have a different air to this. We cannot assume, we can't know how the world would react if the official position would be the one-state solution. And I think that's a very important lesson we are learning now. Each one of us who is involved in creating the one-state movement from below, on the ground, in historical Palestine, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip. So I think this is an important initiative that's going to succeed. About the conference, it's a real initiative. I mean, it wasn't just an idea throughout in the air. We are working on it. It's very difficult. We are working with ultra-Orthodox Jews of the Neturei Karta and Satmar orders, and we work with the LGBT community in the States. Can you imagine two groups standing together in a Basel conference? But we're hopeful. We think we've seen miracles. As Jews, we believe in miracles. And I can see the founder of Neturei Karta hugging someone of his own gender, not knowing that he created how did your friend say, the gates of the revolutions have been opened. Thank you.